Anne of Green Gables. Great illustrated classics. By L.M. Montgomery. Adaptation by Eliza Gatewood Warren and illustrations by Joseph Miralles. Published by Baronet Books. Table of contents. This is information about the author, Lucy Maud Montgomery. And this is chapter 1. The news is shocking. Mrs. Rachel Lynn was a busybody who lived in Avonlea, a town on beautiful Prince Edward Island off Canada's Atlantic coast. Now, Avonlea occupied a little peninsula that jutted out with water on both sides. It was impossible for any traveler on the hill road to pass in and out of town without Mrs. Rachel noticing. And notice she did. Every spare minute she had, she sat by her kitchen window knitting her cotton warp quilts and watching the comings and goings on the road. One June morning, she was amazed to see Matthew Cuthbert drive by. Not only was he using his buggy and sorrel mare, but he was wearing his best suit. All this led Mrs. Rachel to believe Matthew was traveling out of Avonlea, a fair distance, no doubt. Now, where was Matthew Cuthbert going, and why? If it had been any other man in town, Mrs. Rachel would have known the answer to those questions. But Matthew was different from other folks. He was a shy man who never visited or ventured far from home. She felt certain that Matthew must be on an important mission. I'll just go over to Green Gables after tea and find out from Marilla what Matthew is up to, Mrs. Rachel muttered. I want to get to the bottom of this mystery. Green Gables, a large rambling house set amid flowering orchards, was located a quarter-mile up the road from Lynn's Hollow. When Mrs. Rachel arrived there later in the afternoon, Matthew's sister Marilla was sitting in her tidy kitchen, knitting. Behind her, 3 plates were laid on the table. Marilla must be expecting Matthew to bring someone home for tea, Mrs. Rachel thought. However, the dishes were everyday dishes, and there were only crab apple preserves and one kind of cake. The company could not be anyone special. Yet what could explain Matthew's unusual appearance today? Good evening, Rachel, Marilla said. She was a tall, thin woman who wore her gray-streaked hair swept up in a bun on the back of her head. Won't you sit down? How are all your folks? We are all fine, Mrs. Rachel answered. I was worried about you, though, when I saw Matthew drive by earlier. I thought maybe he was going to get the doctor because you were ill. Oh, I'm quite well, Marilla told her, knowing full well how curious her nosy neighbor must be about Matthew's trip. Matthew went to Bright River. We're getting a little boy from an orphanage in Nova Scotia, and he's coming on the train tonight. If Marilla had said that Matthew had gone to Bright River to meet a kangaroo from Australia, Mrs. Rachel could not have been more astonished. Nothing would never surprise her again. Nothing. What on earth put such a notion in your head, Marilla? She demanded disapprovingly. "We've been thinking of this all winter," Marilla said. "Mrs. Alexander Spencer was here before Christmas. She said she was going to get a little girl from the Hopton orphanage in the spring. So Matthew and I decided to get a boy. We sent word to Mrs. Spencer by her brother, Robert, to pick out someone someone about 11 who can help with the chores. Matthew is 60 years old now, and he's not as spry as he used to be. He has a slight heart condition, you know." "Well, Marilla, I'll tell you right out. I think you're doing a risky thing. You're bringing a strange child into your house, and you don't know a thing about him. Why, only last week I read in the paper how a couple took in an orphan boy, and he set their house on fire. He nearly burned them to a crisp in their beds." "I admit, I've had some doubts myself, Rachel," Marilla told her neighbor, who was red in the face from her outburst. "But Matthew's mind was made up. I could see that. So I gave in." "Well, I hope it turns out all right," replied Mrs. Rachel anxiously. "Just the other day I heard about an orphan girl who put poison in her adopted family's well." "We're not getting a girl," said Marilla, ignoring Mrs. Rachel's gloomy comment. "I'd never dream of raising a girl. So you see, Rachel, the matter is all settled." Mrs. Rachel would have liked to stay at Green Gables until Matthew returned with his young charge, but that would have been a long wait. She decided to drop by Robert Bell's house to tell this unbelievable news. It would certainly create sensations, and Mrs. Rachel loved to create a sensation. The truth was that Marilla was glad to see her leave. "Well, of all things that ever were or ever will be," Mrs. Rachel said when she was safely out in the lane, "I'm sorry for that poor boy waiting at the station. Matthew and Marilla don't know anything about raising children. They'll expect him to be wiser than his own grandfather. I just can't imagine a child at Green Gables. After all, there's never been one there before." At the very moment she spoke those words, Matthew Cuthbert drove up to the bright river station. At first he thought he was early, but the station master told him the 5:30 train had come and gone. To his dismay, the young orphan boy he had come to meet was nowhere to be seen. The only person in sight was a skinny, red-haired girl sitting straight and tall on a pile of shingles at the end of the station platform. Matthew walked past her hurriedly, avoiding her gaze. Yet out of the corner of his eye he could see that her hands were clasped tightly in front of her, and that her body was tense and rigid. He had the feeling that this poor child was waiting anxiously for someone.